Now this one is pretty bizarre. Recently, a friend of mine brought over his 2008 LS3 Powered C6 Corvette, and he told me that he had it at a different shop recently to get the oil changed, and while they were changing the oil, they noticed that the oil wasn't quite flowing as it should through the hole in the oil pan when they took the drain plug out. So after further investigation, the shop noticed that there was a little chunk of metal partially blocking the hole in the oil pan, so they pushed it in a little bit and the oil flowed out as it should. Well, clearly that's not good. You shouldn't have a chunk of metal in your oil pan. And they told him to investigate further. They'd have to remove the oil pan.
I did end up having to take the subframe and dropping it a little bit
and see what that chunk of metal was. And they gave him a quote of something like $3,000. And I'm not sure if that was just to remove the oil pan and identify what was in it, or to fix the problem. Now fortunately, the owner of this particular C6 is a scientist by trade, and he had the quick thought to ask for his used oil filter before he left their shop with his C6 Corvette. So now it's been a couple of weeks, and in the meantime, the owner has reached out to other technicians and other friends and to me, trying to figure out what he should do because he's concerned about this chunk of metal in his oil pan that doesn't belong there. And so far he's heard everything from, well, it's probably going to be okay, so just let it run, to you got to take it apart and see exactly what that chunk of metal is, and everything in between. What do you think he should do? So the owner and I discussed several actions to take to investigate and try to figure out what to do next with his C6. And the first thing is to cut his used oil filter apart that had 4,000 miles on it, and I'll extract the media to look for any sort of metal or debris that doesn't belong in there that would be indicative of a catastrophic failure. Second, we'll go ahead and drain his oil and see if there's any metal chunks, big or small, sticking to that magnetic tip on his drain plug. Third, we'll dig a little deeper and get closer, and with a pen magnet, I'll stick it in the hole and see if I can find that metal chunk and turn it a little bit and just try to get a glimpse of what that metal chunk might be. And fourth, remove both of his valve covers and inspect all of the roller rocker arms for any signs of damage to their roller fulcrum, because these are a known weak spot that occasionally fail and the little end caps come off and needle bearings fall out and spill through the engine. So here's what we found. The first thing I did is I cut open his used oil filter from that oil change and remove the filter media to take a good look at it in the outside sunlight. There were a couple of very small metal specks in the filter media, which is not terribly uncommon and really nothing else of concern. And so with that, I was pretty satisfied that there was nothing catastrophic going on within his engine, which is a very good thing. Then I went ahead and removed his oil plug from the oil pan, and remember, his oil plug has that magnetic tip on it, and yes, that chunk of metal was still stuck to the magnetic tip on the plug, so when I pulled it away from the oil pan, I could still see the chunk of metal right there in the hole, and that was very interesting. My first thought was that this chunk of metal I could see inside the hole of the oil pan was bigger than I thought it was going to be, so I grabbed my pen magnet, which is actually a pretty strong magnet, and I stuck it through the hole, and it definitely grabbed that chunk of metal strongly, and I was trying to spin it and rotate it, and it wouldn't go very far, so clearly this thing was not only wide, but it was also several inches long as well. What the heck is this chunk of metal that is inside of this LS3's oil pan? If you think you know, pause the video and leave it in the comments below. My first thought is that it kind of looks like an engine bearing shell from a connecting rod or the crank main bearing, not one that had gotten hot and spun and destroyed and fallen out of his engine, but perhaps an extra that was somehow left inside the engine during the assembly at the GM plant. Then I got out my Boroscope and decided to go inside of the pan for a closer look. This little color Depth Boroscope has two cameras, one on the tip and one on the side. It's got a light, it records video, takes photographs, and once again, it absolutely pays for itself by giving us a pretty good look at what's hiding inside. And here is the actual footage of what the Depth sees once it gets inside. Here we are underneath the car, headed in through the drain plug hole. You can even see the threads as we go through the hole, and the image you're seeing is at a slight angle with the thin oil layer on the bottom of the oil pan, and here is the chunk of large metal. It's definitely shiny and curved, and it even looks like it has lots of small scratches running lengthwise along its entire surface. Based on this imagery, I think you can see why, to me, it looks kind of like a bearing shell. Let's take another look, this time using the side lens on the DAMPNER Boroscope, and again you can see how shiny and curved it is, and now we just need to find out what the heck is this chunk of metal. Well, with those pretty decent images we got from the DAMPNER Boroscope, we decided not to go down the rabbit hole of removing the valve covers and inspecting the rocker arm trunnions, because that piece of metal is clearly much larger than anything on the rocker arm. Also, when I pulled his C6 into the shop, I listened very carefully and the engine sounded exactly as it should for, I think it's got around 60,000 miles on it, and the oil pressure was about 27-28 pounds per square inch at idle, with the oil at about 207 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty good. So at this point, including the fact that he doesn't have anything unusual in his oil filter media, I'm pretty confident that he doesn't have any kind of a rod or main bearing issue going on. Although I must admit that I do wonder what exactly would happen if, when this engine was made at the GM plant, one of the lower main bearing shells in the middle of the crankshaft was left out. The crank would still be supported by 2 additional main bearings on each side, and the oil enters the crankshaft from above. It goes through the upper half of the bearing shell and then down to one of the connecting rod journals. I'm sure somebody out there knows for sure because they've made this mistake before, but they probably don't want to fess up to it. Anyways, the owner was here in the shop with me. We discussed it and he decided to have me button up the engine for now, and I told him that I could remove the oil pan in the near future so that we could remove that chunk of metal and hopefully identify for sure exactly what it was. As he left that night, I thought a little bit about it, and I was still probably in the camp that somehow during the engine manufacturing process at GM, an extra bearing half was somehow left in the engine and was just sitting in the bottom of the oil pan. As I also mentioned, the owner of the car is a scientist, and I think he spent a fair bit of time over the next 24 hours researching it as well, and I received an email from him asking if it could be part of a broken timing chain tensioner. Bingo! Starting in 2007, I think it was, GM came up with a new and improved spring-loaded timing chain tensioner to improve upon the plastic block style, like the one that's in my C6 LS2. Now, I was aware that the new and improved timing chain tensioner design was known to have reliability issues, but I was not aware, or at least I don't remember, that some owners have reported that when this new and improved timing chain tensioner design fails, some of them have ended up with a shiny piece of curved metal way down in the bottom of their oil pan. So I think this owner is correct, and now I think there's a 99% chance that that's exactly what's in his oil pan. So now the million-dollar question is, what should the owner of this C6 have me do about the problem? If you weren't aware, the LS1 engines didn't even have a timing chain tensioner, and then somewhere in the late LS1, LS6, early LS2 design, GM started using the plastic timing chain tensioner design, and then I think in 2007 they improved it with this spring-loaded tensioner, which is likely what he has broken inside of his engine. I told him that if it was my engine, I would go in through the front of the engine, which is labor-intensive unfortunately, inspect the timing chain tensioner. I think we're going to find that it's broken, and if it is, then that is the chunk of metal that's in his oil pan. Either way, I would replace that timing chain tensioner with the LS2 style plastic block and inspect the timing chain and gears as well, and replace anything that is questionable. And of course, if he goes this route, he has another decision to make. Because of the fact that the whole front of the engine is taken apart, we are 99% of the way there to what it would take to add a performance camshaft. So now is the time to do that if he's ever thought of doing so. What about you guys? What would you have me do if this was your car? Please leave a comment below including why. The owner and I would absolutely appreciate it. And while you're at it, please tap that thumbs up. Consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. And most of all, thanks for watching.